Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 26 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, economic justice, and nonviolent social change. Every few years, we've produced a program about homelessness. This month's program looks at some positive new strategies to deal with homelessness in our local Thurston County, and we hope that viewers from elsewhere will consider how they might adapt these new strategies for their own local communities. I'm happy to welcome three guests who have extensive firsthand experience. Selena Kilmoyer has worked for many years to meet the needs of people who don't have places to live and for young people and other people at risk. When she came to Olympia, she worked with Bread and Roses, the local house of hospitality based on the Catholic worker model, and she's worked with other agencies as well. Welcome, Selena. Good to have you here. Teresa Slusher is the homeless coordinator for Thurston County. She accomplished a lot during a one-year appointment and began another one-year term in the spring of 2013. She has more than 18 years of experience working on homeless issues, and she has significantly helped our local community address the problems in an effective and well-organized way. Good to have you here, Teresa.
Thank you.
And Jill Severn has served a number of years as president of the local board working with Camp Quixote, the homeless encampment that is self-governed and has operated very effectively for several years. Camp Quixote has moved every few months from one church parking lot to another, and now it's planning for a permanent location in the southwest Olympia Tumwater area with very small cottages. Jill, good to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'm glad we have three guests who all have good, solid, firsthand knowledge of what's going on. Let's start by helping the viewers understand who is homeless and why. Jill, can you get us started with this?
Well, there are many sort of subgroups of homeless people. There are people with children, there are the newly unemployed, the victims of the recent recession. At Camp Quixote, who we mostly deal with are people that would be defined as chronically homeless, people who've been homeless for a long time or have had multiple episodes of homelessness. And among our population of homeless people, there are histories of severe trauma, really difficult childhoods with a lot of what are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which we can talk more about later. People who have mental illness in our group of adult homeless, chronically homeless, mental illness is a huge factor. And mental illness, self-medicated, leading to addiction is a big factor as well. So the kind of folks that live at Camp Quixote are people who in the past would have relied on labor-ready or day labor jobs. They're sort of the lowest wage jobs in the economy. And especially with the last recession, those jobs have become harder and harder to get because as there are more unemployed people, the qualifications for those jobs get ratcheted up and a whole sort of subpopulation gets eliminated essentially from qualifying for jobs that they previously could have held.
Right, thanks. And Selena, when we were preparing for the program, you said that we should make sure the viewers don't think that this is only an urban thing, that there's rural poverty and rural homelessness.
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting is when we talk about homelessness in Thurston County, we immediately think Olympia, we think of Tumwater, we think of Lacey. And actually, there are a number of people experiencing homelessness in our rural county area as well. The recent point-in-time count indicated a large number of people couch surf, which means they live with other people, they share their homes. And it's an invisible kind of homelessness. So it's not as obvious until one goes to the food banks in any of the outlying communities. And also another indicator that more and more people are experiencing homelessness is the ever-growing number of faith communities who are providing meals in the Yelm, in the Rainier, and in Chenino area. Roof as well operates in Rochester, and that's even a more rural area. And so when we consider solutions for homelessness, it's so important that we consider full county solutions and not just those that affect the major areas.
Yeah, or downtowns. And one of the strengths of this particular program is that we'll be looking at some of the complexities and varieties of problems and solutions, so that we won't just get stuck in this, oh, it's one of those downtown Olympia things.
Could I add
Yes,
too,
please.
Glenn? We get used to the idea of a homeless person as a person on the street and maybe panhandling and sleeping downtown. But we have other segments of homelessness in Thurston County as well, which are youth. We have teens who are living, maybe their families have broken up and they're now don't have a home to go to. They kind of take it on their own and stay with friends or live on the street, actually, in extreme cases. And we also have families who are homeless. So we have families sleeping in cars and doubling up, as Selena's talking about, unfortunately being sheltered in church basements and things like that.
Yeah, there's just a great variety, and
Very.
people find any little niche they can. And so when we look at solutions, we got to make sure that we pay attention to all the different segments.
Exactly,
Yeah.
who have
And-
distinctly different needs.
Yeah,
Right,
and
right.
then meet their particular needs rather than a one-size-fits-all thing that leaves individual needs unmet.
And the ever-growing challenge, of course, is we're able to more and more identify specific needs, but at the same time, the funds are shrinking because war continues. And so we are more challenged now than we probably were at the beginning of this decade.
Yeah, yeah. We should help the viewers understand that this large-scale homelessness that we've been seeing for a number of years now is not something that's inherent, not something that's necessary. And although, like in the Depression of the 1930s, a lot of people were homelessness, we ended up with prosperity from the 40s on into the mid-70s. Wages peaked in this country in the mid-70s, and they've actually been declining since the mid-70s. And a lot of people don't realize that when Ronald Reagan was governor of California in the 70s, he cut funding for the state institutions and failed to follow through with funding for community-based mental health services. So a whole bunch of people got released from mental health institutions, had no place to go, no services, and they ended up on the streets. And we've had those policies persisting, especially after he became president. And the priorities of our federal government have shifted away from meeting people's needs and more toward, war and tax breaks for the rich and tax breaks for big corporations. And ordinary people got squeezed out, and especially people at the bottom. The middle class has hurt some, but politicians keep saying nice things about the middle class, and politicians do not talk about the poor. They don't want to deal with it.
People talk about families should help each other, and there wouldn't be people homeless if we just help each other out, and it's not true. You can't even support yourself, much less another child or your neighbor.
Right.
People can't do it anymore like they used to be able to.
And your point, which is totally correct, also sort of leads to the questions about the complexity of the issue we face. So to house people who are mentally ill, who in decades past would have been in institutions, you need not only housing, but you need the whole constellation of mental health services that are accessible and affordable and good, which is simply not the case for most people now.
Right, and that's part of what you folks are working on with the approach we'll take in this program.
Right, and I think it's worth talking about the relationship between poverty and mental illness. When you look at the statistics about the prevalence of mental illness in our society, you think, why are so many people mentally ill? I mean, it's a huge population of people who have significant mental illness. And I think there's a really strong correlation between being poor and being literally driven crazy. I think that is happening to an awful lot of people.
And they probably both reinforce each other.
Right, the amount of
if you're
trauma.
poor, it'll drive you crazy, and if you've been traumatized or suffered, you're going to end up poor.
Yes, and poverty becomes a series of traumas that lead to mental illness, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, so we need to look at that kind of a systemic approach, and that's one of the things we'll talk about during a good part of the program is how you're looking at the whole system of this. we should also see, are there other misunderstandings or misconceptions that we should be debunking at the outset so people can clear up the common misunderstandings?
Well, I think a big issue is stigma. Stigma about mental health. So people don't feel like they can talk about their mental health conditions in the same way that you would talk about a health condition. People certainly don't feel that they can talk about addiction. We have this incredible kind of philosophy of blame about addiction. And those two stigmas, aside from the stigma against poverty in general, but those two huge stigmas about mental health and addiction I think are big obstacles to sensible policy about people who are homeless.
Yeah, and so those are things that fall upon us in mainstream society to deal with, whereas it's easy to project on poor people, why don't you fix yourself, when part of it is rooted in mainstream society's attitudes and misconceptions where we need to work on our own understandings and misunderstandings if we're going to be effective in solving problems. So, yeah.
Okay, I would agree. Sorry.
Okay. At the federal, state, or local levels, what are some of the traditional ways that governments and local communities have addressed homelessness in the recent decades? What's sort of the mainstream
What
default?
I can say about how homeless programs and have evolved over the years are, you have people who just care about a particular population. So a youth agency will develop housing for its youth that it's trying to serve because it finds a segment of them homeless. The same thing with a mental health agency. They'll start developing housing because they're trying to serve people who are mentally ill who don't have homes. So they're kind of forced to develop housing. So and then there are shelters. A lot of them have, Salvation Army is well known as a shelter. Churches start shelters, and family organizations have started family shelters. So what you've found is that individual programs or agencies who have an interest in a specific population end up having to provide shelter and housing solutions for that population so they can serve them better. And what we're now looking at is changing the way that we're doing that. We're looking at the homeless system of providers as a system rather than individual standalone programs that stand or fall on their own or perform or don't perform on their own. We're starting to look at the whole group as a system.
And there's a related thing that I know you've been working on where instead of the traditional way of counting inputs, like we
Yes.
provided so many beds or so
Right.
many meals or whatever,
Right.
you're trying to move toward outcomes, which is a whole different way of looking, and we'll get into that in a moment. But
Yeah.
but the piecemeal approach of fragmented segments.
And when you fragment your system that way and just leave it up to the do-gooders, there's a lot of do-gooders around. When you leave it up to the do-gooders, somebody gets left out.
Yeah.
So we find that sometimes the most seriously mentally ill, the most chemically addicted, who often have both of those things going on at the same time, and lots of trauma in their backgrounds and in their lives, never get picked up by anybody because it's just, they fall through the cracks. They literally fall through the cracks of a system that's built upon these segregated, ways of building and going about it. So
There's another traditional element that we've seen in Olympia and people have seen probably elsewhere, which is where local governments try to say, you can't be here. We'll prevent you from sitting on the streets, or we'll find some way to make homeless people invisible or whatever.
It's the whack-a-mole policy.
Whack-a-mole, yeah,
Right.
yeah. Wherever they show up, you.
Go somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah.
Go somewhere else.
And that's probably, people in this community are sensitive to that because that's been pervasive. It probably happens in other communities, I'm guessing. But that's
Yes.
also sort of a traditional response that does not solve problems. It just
Right.
moves it around.
right.
It moves it around, and it also says homeless people are criminals by virtue of being homeless.
Right.
It criminalizes the issue, which is absurd.
Yeah.
Just as homeless people are incarcerated for misdemeanors and crimes that really aren't crimes, they're picked up and they're criminalized because they're using the streets to defecate or urinate. They're breaking the law in silly ways that housed people don't have to break the
Right.
law. And so we spend a great deal of money as well incarcerating homeless people. And interestingly enough, that there are folks who are incarcerated who cannot be released until they have an address. And if you're homeless, you do not have an address. It's a challenge.
It's a catch-22, right?
It really
there.
is.
Yeah. So again, it's that fragmented approach that Teresa was talking about. Instead of looking at the whole system, what's really
Exactly.
going on here? It takes one little thing and it gets fixated on that particular
Right.
thing, and not look at the whole system as what's really going on. People have been developing and using some different models and methods that show real respect and for the human dignity and the human needs of folks who don't have a place to live. And you've been working, for example, with Camp Quixote. And when we were preparing for the program here, you mentioned how important the issue of loneliness and isolation are. Because we look at the visible things, like if I'm downtown, I don't want to have to see somebody that doesn't look like me, or whatever that thing. But you're saying from the standpoint of those people, they have needs that we don't recognize, including loneliness and isolation.
Incredible loneliness, yes.
Tell us about that.
We had one guy who came into camp after living on the streets for a fair amount of time, and he said that he had begun to feel that he was a ghost, that he wasn't really sure that he existed as a human being because nobody made eye contact with him. People avoided him, made space for him, and so forth. And he described the experience of coming into camp and being part of the camp community as this profound experience of regaining his physical sense of himself as a human being. It's huge.
When kids are growing up, their parents say, "Don't talk to strangers," and if you don't talk to strangers, you're going to not meet people and not make that human connection, and then people end up being afraid of what they don't know or don't understand. So one of our Peace Vigil signs that we have with the Olympia FOR Peace Vigil says, "Talk with strangers."
Yeah.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be a nice humane thing? Is
Right.
if it was okay to talk with people on the street that you don't know.
People ask me that. They say, "What should I do when I see a homeless person on the street?" Or they ask me for money, and I'm not really comfortable giving them money. Well, how should I respond? What's a humane way to respond? And my advice is to say to them, "I'm not comfortable giving you money, but I wish you well."
Yeah.
I mean, just to make eye contact and have the briefest conversation is a gift.
We find at our Peace Vigils, Wednesday noon hour at Sylvester Park and Friday late afternoon at Percival Landing, folks come by and many appear to be homeless. I couldn't say for sure, but a lot of folks are surprisingly well-read, well-informed about public affairs. We can discuss foreign policy, we can discuss economics, and some of these folks hang out at the library and they study up on things, and it's really enjoyable to have a real conversation about current events and substantive issues like, what kind of foreign policy would you like to see, or how do you critique this thing that they're doing about the tax rate, or whatever, and these folks have, they would talk politics just like any of us would, and yet people will say, "Oh, this guy looks like he's homeless, I don't want to talk with him." You
He's
can
got
have
nothing
you
to
can have a
say.
real conversation, just like, yeah. And Camp Quixote is so much different from social service agencies, and you're clear to distinguish why this is not a social service agency. Tell us about that.
Okay, well, it requires a little bit of history. So Camp Quixote started as a protest in a downtown parking lot. And they built this encampment as a protest against the original whack-a-mole ordinance that forbade people from sitting on the sidewalks. Which, however you feel about that ordinance, for homeless people, it was just another, "You are not welcome here, you are worthless." It was just another insult. So they started this homeless encampment, which they named Camp Quixote, in the parking lot behind the Brotherhood. And just at the point where the police were going to come whack that mole and dismantle the camp, the Unitarian Church stepped forward and offered them sanctuary on church grounds. So the camp established itself, and the churches offered to help. So it was the faith communities helping an established organization that was of, by, and for people who are homeless. And that is a very different relationship. We, the Panza board that supports Camp Quixote, we are not a social service provider. We are an equal partner with the camp. And the camp has its own governing council. Every resident in the camp is a member and has an equal voice and an equal vote. And Panza is a support organization that supports that self-governance structure. So, for instance, the camp we do background checks on people before they come into camp, and we screened very minimally for recent history of theft and violence, and we are not allowed by ordinance to take sex offenders. And then the camp resident council, which meets every Sunday night, actually interviews prospective residents and then votes to admit them. So when a person comes into camp, they have joined a community, and they, by virtue of that ritual of having been voted in, know that they have joined a community, that they will have a voice, and that they have responsibilities as part of that community. It's a very different thing than being in a shelter.
Yeah, and it's real democracy, real practicing democracy at the grassroots level with a small enough number of people that you can get to know each other. You know, you have a name, you're not just...
There are pluses and minuses to that.
Yeah.
There are resident council meetings that are wonderful, and then there are resident council meetings that are awful. And after the ones that I think are really awful, where, you know, people fought and there was contention and so forth, I think, yeah, and how is the state legislature doing?
Yeah.
And we always come out ahead.
Yeah, good. Well, it's just a neat model that gets beyond the way that we otherwise get stuck so much. So I appreciate that. And we'll talk some more.
About the difficulty of democracy, yes.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk some more later in the program about the vision for the future with Quixote Village. And people should know that this comes from Cervantes' novel about Don Quixote, the guy who's tilting at windmills and off on this quest for this impossible dream.
Right, and Panza, which
And Panza
supports, was his servant.
Yeah. So it's a great model, and it's worth rereading the book. That's a classic from hundreds of years. A few years ago, I was attending an event in Seattle. It was a peace and social justice and economic justice event, and there was an official from King County who was talking about how enthusiastic they were to have a model that says, in dealing with the homelessness issue, we want to put first priority in getting people into some housing. We're not going to keep you homeless while we deal with your mental illness or your alcohol or your drugs or your whatever. The first thing is get the people into some stable housing. And they were very enthusiastic about this. And I know you're pursuing that model here. Could one of you tell us about that?
I'll tell you about it. I just recently visited Downtown Emergency Services Center, and they're based in Seattle. And this is where this concept started. And they served all of the homeless, the street homeless in Seattle, and had a shelter, and they just filled shelter beds every night. They had a lottery system for who got a bed and who didn't get a bed, and it was tearing them up. And they figured these people could never be housed. But what they did is they started flipping the idea of that somebody has to get clean and sober and address their mental health issues, and then they earn housing. They decided to flip that, and they felt like we would be more effective with our mental health services and our chemical dependency services if we housed people first and let them stop relying on, trying to meet basic needs every day.
Because that provides some basic stability,
Yes.
which then would free somebody up to deal with these other...
That's right. And so they did. They built a housing project called the 1811 Project. It's very well known based on that concept. But even then, they assessed people when they came in for housing readiness. So they interviewed them, and they asked them a lot of questions, and they tried to select only the people they thought could stay in housing, were ready for housing. And so they built it, and they didn't require that people were clean and sober. They didn't require they stop drinking. They allowed drinking in their apartments just like anybody else would be able to drink in their own.
I can drink in my house.
I can drink in my house. And wet housing, you'll hear that term. I have a wet house. So they don't like that term, wet housing.
Right.
Everybody has the option to have wet housing. So, and what they found is that people decreased their use, not by being asked to, but just by being safe. They measured. So they measured and had, I can't remember, University of Washington or somebody come in and actually do a study. And they reduced their drinking by 50% in the first year on their own. So it's a harm reduction model.
Yeah, harm reduction is a good way, like with the drug issue.
Yeah.
Find ways to reduce the damage that is caused.
Right.
And that will end up reducing.
And they also decreased use of public services, so they measured hospital stays for these folks and police and jail time or police contacts. I don't know if it was jail time or police contacts, but they reduced both.
Okay, and one of the things that you're working on is for homeless folks is rapid rehousing.
Yeah,
Tell
so
us about that
housing
concept.
first I just described, so that's
Yeah.
put them into housing and work on serious issues after they're housed. And rapid rehousing, so that, the first model I talked about is permanent housing, and you apply services after they're permanently housed. So it's a highly supportive model of housing.
Yeah.
Rapid rehousing is less supportive, so it's meant to take somebody and provide a little bit of rental assistance, tailor it to how long they might need it.
And so that's a different population. The first would be people who are, who've probably been
Chronically
without a place
homeless,
for a long
probably
time.
have multiple issues.
Right,
chemical
and this
defense
other
in the
is
house.
get people into housing without having them be,
You're
get
not-
into a trap of being long-term.
You don't keep them in shelters for a long
Yeah.
time. You don't keep them in transitional housing. As soon as somebody approaches the system, you assess them. If they're able to be rapidly rehoused, you give them a little bit of deposit money and rent money for a short term. However long you assess they're going to need to either get a job or get on their feet, and then you let them go and take it on their own. And so it's rapid in that
Yeah.
sense.
So it's a flexible approach based on the person's needs.
Right.
And you're doing what we had mentioned earlier in the program of trying to figure out what the person really needs and
Yes.
then meet that rather than a one-size-fits-all.
Right.
So that gets us into thinking about the systems approach that
Yes.
you're working on. For a long time, there have been like programs, this and that and whatever else, and different agencies and whatnot. And so now tell us about the systems approach that you're trying to do in Thurston County.
Well, so what we're doing is we're first looking at the whole system and how it operates as it is, and we're seeing how much of what we have, what's working, what's not really working. Some agencies are overburdened, and some agencies could probably restructure the way they're doing things and maybe serve a few more people. And so we're taking a look at that. I've worked with the community to develop a gaps analysis, and so that
So you want to look at where there are gaps.
where there are actual gaps in the system and see if we can't plug those. That's the next wave, is to look at how we can plug those. So we've identified some big gaps, some 5 top priority gaps that we can work on. I can list them for you.
Yeah,
So youth shelter is one. We do have a large number of youth who are downtown and elsewhere that need some support. So youth shelter and a youth bridge program. So they need also pathways to housing for youth that are mindful of their developmental needs because they're young still. And then we have rapid rehousing that we just talked about for families. I think we're almost maxed out at to how we can use that for single people. What we need for single people is permanent supportive housing, like Coyote Village coming along. Yeah, we need permanent supportive housing for single folks that can't be served by rapid rehousing. They have deeper needs.
Yeah. So the idea then is look at where the gaps are, so you can see is there some segment of the population that we're not serving or not serving adequately, and do that.
I left one out, Glenn. Low
ahead.
barrier shelter. We have a low barrier shelter, a need for low barrier shelter for single men, women, and couples who are mainly the ones you're seeing staying downtown. So
Right.
that will provide day services, a day center, and restroom facilities and those things.
Is that what you're going to talk
No,
about?
I was actually going to point
Oh.
out that one of the newest things happening, which is most commonsensical, is points of entry.
Yes.
So Catholic community youth services for the young people, family support center for families with children, and the new sidewalk program for the singles.
Yeah, and sidewalk is on 5th Avenue, just down the hill a bit from the Methodist Church.
Right, it's actually, it's a building of the Methodist Church.
Yeah, right.
actually.
Yeah, but I mean it's down, it's
Right.
near the church building itself. It's
Right. And so I'm interrupting you simply
No,
because
please do.
We finally are realizing that, again, that there are subpopulations. And so if there can be one agency responsible for the beginning of a process for a person once he or she identifies as homeless or the family identifies, it makes the transition along the way much, much better. And again, it's that coordinated approach.
Right.
So we know where people need to start. We know how to refer better,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, otherwise somebody says, I don't know, go talk to DSHS, or I don't know, go talk to
Right.
whatever, and they get
Exactly.
bounced around.
Yep.
Right.
And this way, if it's families, family support center is a contact point, and they're down in the old fire station
Yes.
for a long
Right.
time, Olympia people
Right.
down at Capitol and State. the Family Support Center for Families, sidewalk that we just mentioned on Fifth Avenue, heading up the hill on the east side. And we'll have the links to these at the end of the show in the credits for single folks.
And community services
And then
for you.
CYS, they're on State, just a little bit on the downtown side from Plum for young people. So that's some clarity there.
And as Selena talked about earlier, the rural areas, we do have some work to do to figure out how we get this coordinated entry system to work for outlying areas, because it doesn't make sense for them to have to transport in. So that's the next, that's some work I'll be doing over the next year as well.
Yeah. So those entry points would make sense. Let's see. Let me pick up one more thing. Your housing coordinator role. I mentioned that when I introduced you at the beginning of the show. What would be the role of housing coordinator? Maybe people figured it out by now, but add something.
Well, a housing coordinator can kind of be the one person whose job it is to think about this stuff, really. I mean, that's part of it, is that there is one person that anybody can call and say, there's a gap here, I have something I want to connect my service to, or I have a need. So somebody has an eye on the system. That's one of the biggest things. But there's also this work that needs to be done to beef up parts of the system that aren't being beefed up on their own. So the single men and women who get left out, who are sleeping downtown, the society has let them fall through the gaps. They're fallen. And it's no one person's job to go pick them up and make sure there's something for them. That's the job of a homeless coordinator.
Well, and you connect the dots, and you're doing some research and the analysis.
Looking at data.
And the data tracking, which is interesting. So you're actually finding out what the actual facts are, the numbers and so forth. And then you got a feedback loop into this so that you'll find out, okay, a year later, how did we do? And not just track the inputs, like how many beds were filled, but how many people got put into real housing.
For an example, a shelter, they used to be just assessed on how many beds do you provide a year. That's all you wanted to know about a shelter and how effective it was. Now we want to know, do you connect people to permanent housing? When they leave you, where do they go?
Yeah, and you told me on the phone when we were preparing for the program that 70% of the people who are leaving shelters are going for some undefined location.
Going to an unknown location when they leave. We don't know.
Yeah, so.
And we can do better than that as a system.
Yes, that's good. Let's see, we've talked about rapid rehousing and did we talk about the 24-hour, get people something within 24 hours? I don't know if we've mentioned that yet.
We haven't mentioned that. So as a community, we're adopting goals, and the Home Consortium, which is the body who manages and makes recommendations to county commissioners on homeless funding, has adopted a set of vision and some goals. And one of them is to make sure that when people identify as homeless, as Selena pointed out earlier, they know where to go, so they know who to call. And another piece of that is to make sure that to set some goals for the system. So one of them is within 30 days, we want to set a goal that people will be permanently housed within 30 days. So no longer 90 days in shelter or long amounts of time lingering in some shelter program. We want people to be housed much quicker than that. And it's going to take a while. I don't mean to sound like I'm criticizing the system of providers as they are now. I'm not at all. I think they're great providers. I just think now that we have the opportunity to coordinate and look at data and how we're doing and set some goals, we can do better. It's what you measure, what's the phrase? You do what you measure, or what you measure gets done.
Right.
And that's the concept. So I'm the person to start looking at this data and kind of mirroring it back and saying, can't we do better than this if we try?
Yeah, and those feedback loops are so important if we're going to actually learn from our experiences. There's something we mentioned about supportive housing, and I want to make sure that the viewers get a handle on that. And you had talked about this when we were preparing on the phone. We have some good facilities. There's an apartment building in Tumwater for people who have mental health difficulties to get some good housing. Drexel House does good stuff. With some support for folks, and you talked about the need for some more permanent supportive housing. Tell us what the concept is or what the needs might be.
Well, there are a number of people who need ongoing support. Just because they get housed does not mean that they can function on their own. They need, they oftentimes need help, reminders, even paying their bills. Those very basic helps, as well as people needing professional mental health. And so when I think of permanent supportive housing, I don't necessarily think of the big projects like Drexel House or Tumwater Gardens. There is the possibility of cluster permanent support housing, where mental health professionals could visit various houses which housed 4 or 5 people who needed the wraparound services.
Yeah. So like a house, you get a house, a 4-bedroom house, you rent it, each person gets a room, and then it keeps the cost down.
Right.
Because you split the rent of the house
Exactly.
4 ways. And then it's a handy location for the...
For professional connections, as well as friends. And I think one of the major roles that the Sidewalk Advocacy Center is providing is volunteers who are willing to journey with, to walk beside, is from when the name comes, people who are experiencing homelessness. So once a person is housed, the advocates, the friends at Sidewalk, continue keeping in touch with them. Jill alluded to community. We need to stay connected. And so that's an important piece that we can do, and it doesn't entail necessarily new projects. We can be creative, and as my Irish mother would have said, we can make do with what we have.
But that's a good model, and it picks up on the need for having a sense of community. If 4 of us share a house, we can be supports for each other. Even if we have a professional come in now and then to help out with.
And there's a wide variety of ways you can do permanent supportive housing. Quixote Village will be permanent supportive housing because we will have an on-site social worker who helps with exactly those kinds of things.
And then overall in the community and probably in the nation as a whole, there's not enough housing at a low enough rate for people. I mean, when you look at where people's incomes are and with what the price of houses have done in the last few decades, we got a wider
I say
gap there.
housing's my biggest bill every month, and I think it is for most everybody. And so, big surprise when some people can't maintain that.
If you're,
I mean, really, one of the biggest causes of homelessness is just the financial burden. And if anything happens, if you get sick for an extended period of time, or have a child who's sick, or have a mental health crisis or a breakdown, you're not going to maintain housing.
You lose a job, or you lose a good job, and you end up on minimum wage, and before long you're out. Did we talk enough about the low barrier 24/7 shelter for adults? I want to make sure people get that, because that's an important concept.
There's a need, a very great need for people who are homeless to have a place where they can freely go and be without rules or restrictions. So therefore the low barrier, a place where they're welcome. I think probably a good example, although it had many problems, was the old Cherry Street Bread and Roses Kitchen Day Center.
Down between 4th and State on Cherry, downtown Olympia.
And it was the community center for the homeless and the marginalized. It served a tremendous need in our community. And when it closed, that sense of community went away, and now a decade later, we're realizing as community, we need this.
Because you could eat there, you can wash your clothes there, you could take a shower, you can hang out with your friends, get your mail there, you can make phone calls. If you're looking for a job and the employer needs to have a place where they can phone you, well, they could phone you there, and then you can check in and get your messages and get your job appointment, job interview.
I mean, even accessing the mental health system, you have to be able to make an appointment, keep an appointment, change an appointment. You know, you have to have some kind of regular home base to be able to take care of some of these basic needs, even the most functional.
And as well as the social, because if that's where my friends are, that's the place to stay and stay connected. It was just a great resource.
I think the term low barrier is confusing to people. But what's meant by low barrier is you don't have to pass a background check, you don't have to meet specific requirements in order to get in. And for a lot of folks downtown, that's an issue. because some of the existing shelters have more rules than
Yeah.
they have residents.
Right.
And the rules can become barriers. So
Yeah.
it's a minimal rules. You might want to explain that more.
And I think it's that sense of, it's the Catholic worker sense of hospitality, and people are simply welcome
Yeah.
without any restrictions on who they are.
Yeah.
And that can frighten people because we think, wow, wow.
Anybody
But
could
the-
come in here.
But the point is, that's exactly what we all need. We need the freedom to know that there is some place where we belong.
Yeah.
And that's what is lacking right now.
Yeah, and that's a positive step toward mental health. Is to
Absolutely.
know that you're okay, you're welcome, and to live in a world where everybody is telling you no, 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 no. What does that do to a person?
Right.
Exactly.
And so that sense, I mean, in some of the overnight shelters, they kick you out at breakfast time.
Before breakfast time, Glenn.
Yeah, well, I mean, early in the morning.
Right.
Very early.
Earlier than I want to get up. And so then what do? You hang out. Well, good thing we have libraries, and librarians are wonderful. And these folks go there and they get well read, some of them, so that's good. But yeah, we need a place to be. And so a low barrier where everybody's welcome, and shelter plus the daytime activities, and a place to get your laundry done, and a place to get your phone messages and pick up your mail and all that. Just powerful stuff. And then, is there anything else you want to say about youth, either a youth shelter or youth bridge programming?
Not at this point. We don't have a lot of details around what that bridge program looks like. It's very much in development right now,
Okay.
that concept. But youth shelter, the numbers from the point in time count are showing that youth homelessness is on the rise. And
Yeah, and Community Youth Services that you're working with is a great agency.
wonderful agency.
Those folks care and they know what they're doing, so
Right.
that's good. Anything else you want to say about gathering data and analyzing and the feedback loop? We've covered some of that.
I don't know that I need to say any more about
Okay.
it, except for I'm just really excited to finally look at homelessness more in a humane, systematic model where we're looking at data. We're not pointing fingers at anybody. We're just looking at the data. And the data shows that whether we're talking about low barrier shelter or chronically homeless people or whatever, that we can do better than we're doing. And if we just take a look at our system and work on continual improvement, we'll get there.
Okay. And during the program here, we've talked about some issues that relate to homelessness, including mental illness, including alcohol, drug, youth, other factors and variables. Is there anything we want to say about any of these beyond what we've done?
I can say that we're making connections now. So again, things used to be done in a very siloed, segregated way. And now we've got groups where we've got we have a low barrier shelter group meeting to try to figure out how we can bring this program to a reality. And we've got a downtown business owner on that group. We had police there to begin with. They were kind of the ones starting this conversation about the need for a downtown shelter that was low barrier.
Would they respect it then? If they're in on the ground floor and
Yes.
supporting it,
when you've got a chief of
that's an
police
ally.
who's convening meetings about what are we going to do to create a low barrier shelter, I'm there.
So what we need to do is cultivate these
Yes.
opportunities and resources that may not have been there before.
Yes, we've got hospitals.
Yeah.
We're having conversations
Yeah.
with them as well. So
Right, and those connections, we have such a long way to go on that. We have a guy back at camp this week who lived in camp, left to go to a clean and sober house in another community where he had a suicide attempt, ended up being hospitalized, and from the hospital was discharged back to the street. So I think that's pretty common, that hospitals discharge to the street.
Yeah.
And for people with mental illness who, it's just appalling.
Yeah. When Occupy Olympia was functioning downtown, they had the occasion where a woman was discharged from the hospital. The hospital put her in a taxi and sent her down, dropped her off at Occupy Olympia. So they discharged her to Occupy Olympia, and they
To an
became
event.
a de facto
Right.
mental health, housing, community, blah, blah, blah resource, and that's beyond the scope of what they could do.
And I'd like to just jump in and say that there's a group, Tumwater Councilman Neil McClanahan is part of a group that have been literally working for 3 years to try to get a respite house up and running for people who are homeless, who are discharged from the hospital. It's just taking a long time. It's a process. And it seems like such a mindless thing, and yet it's not at all.
Yeah.
So it's not as though the hospital intentionally is being cruel and unfortunate. That's just their policy. But again, as Jill said, we are in many ways just infants in developing relationships with community partners.
Yeah.
But it's fun that we're trying to do new partners.
Well, you're doing things here, and I keep wondering where other communities around the country are at. I suspect that probably a lot of them are way behind here. I'm guessing. I don't know.
Some of them are doing amazing things. So you've got the gamut there, and I for one think we've been innovators in the past, and I think we can be innovators again. So
there's another thing that I find often gets left out of the conversation about this. When governments and mainstream media and the general public talks about homelessness, they often fail to put this in the context of poverty and unemployment and low wages. And like I said at the early part of the program, wages peaked in this country in the mid-'70s, and they've been declining, and people can't support themselves on a minimum wage job. And big businesses have been shutting down factories here and moving them overseas with, quote, free trade policies and all of that stuff. And to try to look at homelessness without seeing the context of what's happening at the big level of the economy and what damage is being done to the economic system.
erode.
I think we're missing out. We need to connect those dots as well as connecting the dots
And
that
if
you're
I
all
could
working
also
on.
give another perspective example, homelessness in Thurston County, it's 0.4% of our population is homeless. It's not this huge group of people out there sucking from taxpayers. It's a small amount of our population that needs help. So let's just help them.
Yeah. I want to talk some more about the plans for Quixote Village. So Camp Quixote, which we've talked about, has the vision and some property laid out in southwest Olympia, Tumwater area to create Quixote Village, which would have some very small cottages. Tell us about that. What's being planned?
Well, our site was actually provided by our wonderful county commissioners who've been very supportive along the way for what we're doing. So when Camp Quixote was first founded, they never intended to be a tent camp for a long time. Their intention was to create this tent camp, and then they wanted to build this village. So it's the original design of the residents themselves. And their idea was to have 30 little one-room cabins and then a central community building that would have showers and a big kitchen, a communal kitchen, and laundry facilities and so forth. And so that's actually what we're building. So each cottage is 144 square feet. It's just a tiny cottage with a half bath, a toilet, and a sink. And there'll be 30 in a sort of horseshoe shape, and then this community building kind of at the end of the horseshoe. And we're really excited about the progress we're making in building it. And we think that it will be an innovative model that we hope will be so successful it'll be replicated. One of the big issues in permanent supportive housing is cost. And the national average per unit is about $157,000. Our per unit cost, with all the amazing community donations that we've had, will be about $77,000 per unit.
And you told me on the phone that this is going to actually meet code. This won't be some crappy thing that's going to be violating local rules.
The state legislature has provided $1.5 million towards this, and we're also getting some money from HUD. And when you take that money, you make a 40-year commitment. So you have to build buildings that will last for a minimum of 40 years.
And I know some people, letters to the editor of the local paper, have criticized the location, and your response to that critique?
There is no such thing as a perfect location for this sort of thing. We think the location is fine. It's at the edge of an industrial district. So if people said, well, this is residential, so why don't you locate in a residential neighborhood? And we had a hard enough time with NIMBY issues where we are. I can't imagine that if in a residential area, you know, we would have been in court for years instead of merely 1 year. And when we went to the conditional use permit hearing, there were a lot of questions of camp residents themselves about, don't you worry about being at the edge of an industrial, you know, zone, it'll be noisy. And their response was, we've been living under bridges. Noise is the least of our concerns. So that just wasn't an issue for them.
Yeah, I think it's great. It's so exciting to see local folks take bold action and push ahead creatively and create solutions.
And this truly is an amazing project for several reasons. One is that it's the camp residents themselves who have worked with the architect and guided the development of every aspect of the village. And it's also been a project that wouldn't have happened without massive community support. We've lost count of the number of city council and county commission meetings that we have turned out over 100 people for. But the support of people in faith communities and people in the Olympia community generally has been astonishing and wonderful and continues to be, which is good because we'll need it.
Yeah, I live in Lacey, and I remember a few years ago when Lacey was not allowing such a thing, and then people leaned on the Lacey City Council and prevailed because Lacey Community Church had wanted to host it, and they were told, no, you can't. So I mean, it's grassroots activism at its very best. And it occurs to me then that in the context of that and other advances that we've made in our local community, a lot of the best progress that we've made has been when people took nonviolent, bold, creative steps. You just do something that needs to get done, and then it stimulates a community discussion, and eventually we end up with something good. So like when 2 Catholic workers visited Olympia back in the early 80s, 1980-ish, thereabouts, and said, do you think we should have a Catholic worker house of hospitality here? A bunch of us who were at that first meeting said, yes, please do. We need that. And so that was the origin of Bread and Roses. And you told the story already about the vacant lot downtown that became the origin for Camp Quixote, and now you've got this vision for Quixote Village. I remember some years ago, First Baptist Church took on a shelter because Pastor Sam Hochstetter was attending a meeting of people about homelessness, and at the end of the afternoon, one of the guys who was present, who happened to be homeless, said, this has all been interesting, but I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. And Sam said, oh, you can come and sleep at our church. And then he realized what he had done. He had to step out and call the pastor of the church council and say, look what I just promised. and they provided shelter at their church for some time. And in beginning of March of 2013, when a wintertime shelter closed, some people took it upon themselves to set up a temporary shelter by the Artesian Well in downtown Olympia, and then when they got kicked out of there, they moved to some state property that wasn't being used a few blocks north and got kicked out of there. There's bold nonviolent actions where people just say, this needs to get done.
But what's different now is, we talked about this a little bit earlier, that there'll be this insurrection, you know, and you get Bread and Roses, or an insurrection and you get the Fleetwood, or an insurrection and you get Quixote Village. But what's different now is this systematic approach so that we can get beyond having to have an insurrection to make progress. And that's why Teresa is such a wonderful and welcome part of this.
Great step forward. Well, I appreciate all the work that all three of you have been doing, taking bold actions in your various ways and connecting the dots, and the three of you have been working together as well as with so many other people in the community, too numerous to name. There's a lot of people in this town doing really a lot of good stuff on this, beyond the ones that we've mentioned already. Is there any closing short thing to toss out before we wrap this thing up?
I think that everybody needs to take responsibility for ending homelessness, and not just give lip service to, but to really find ways that we can help work with the local politicians and work with the planners and so on and so forth, because it's easy to just point and be naysayers. And we have to dare to do that.
Okay, so tangible, specific, practical things. Well, thank you so much, Selena and Teresa and Jill. It's good to have you here. I've enjoyed the conversation. I hope the viewers have enjoyed this too. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. It seems like we really need to consider as a basic human right that everybody should have a place to live. Local individuals, nonprofit organizations, and governments are pushing ahead now in better ways with some creative approaches and smarter ways to move. They need support from those of us who are willing to volunteer, those of us who are willing to pay taxes to support the needs of the whole community and not just those of us who are in the middle and upper parts. And we need public support to respect the human rights of every person, no matter what their disability or their economic status may be. You can get information about a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093 or www.olympiafor.org. We're all one human family and we all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs whatever it is that you can offer. Thanks. You get us started with this?
Well, there are many sort of subgroups of homeless people. There are people with children, there are the newly unemployed, the victims of the recent recession. At Camp Coyote, who we mostly deal with are people that would be defined as chronically homeless, people who've been homeless for a long time or have had multiple episodes of homelessness. And among our population of homeless people, there are histories of severe trauma, really difficult childhoods with a lot of what are called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which we can talk more about later. People who have mental illness, and in our group of adult homeless, chronically homeless, mental illness is a huge factor. And mental illness, self-medicated, leading to addiction is a big factor as well. So the kind of folks that live at Camp Coyote are people who in the past would have relied on labor-ready or day labor jobs. They're sort of the lowest wage jobs in the economy. And especially with the last recession, those jobs have become harder and harder to get because as there are more unemployed people, the qualifications for those jobs get ratcheted up and a whole sort of subpopulation gets eliminated essentially from qualifying for jobs that they previously could have held.
Right, thanks. And Selena, when we were preparing for the program, you said that we should make sure the viewers don't think that this is only an urban thing, that there's rural poverty and rural homelessness.
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting is when we talk about homelessness in Thurston County, we immediately think Olympia, we think of Tumwater, we think of Lacey. And actually, there are a number of people experiencing homelessness in our rural county area as well.
About homelessness. This month's program looks at some positive new strategies to deal with homelessness in our local Thurston County, and we hope that viewers from elsewhere will consider how they might adapt these new strategies for their own local communities. I'm happy to welcome three guests who have extensive firsthand experience. Selena Kilmoyer has worked for many years to meet the needs of people who don't have places to live and for young people and other people at risk. When she came to Olympia, she worked with Bread and Roses, the local house of hospitality based on the Catholic worker model, and she's worked with other agencies as well. Welcome, Selena. Good to have you here. Teresa Slusher is the homeless coordinator for Thurston County. She accomplished a lot during a one-year appointment and began another one-year term in the spring of 2013. She has more than 18 years of experience working on homeless issues, and she has significantly helped our local community address the problems in an effective and well-organized way. Good to have you here, Teresa. And Jill Severn has served a number of years as president of the local board working with Camp Quixote, the homeless encampment that is self-governed and has operated very effectively for several years. Camp Quixote has moved every few months from one church parking lot to another, and now it's planning for a permanent location in the southwest Olympia Tumwater area with very small cottages. Jill, good to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'm glad we have three guests who all have good, solid, firsthand knowledge of what's going on. Let's start by helping the viewers understand who is homeless and why. Jill, can you...
A recent point in time count indicated a large number of people couch surf, which means they live with other people, they share their homes, and it's an invisible kind of homelessness. So it's not as obvious until one goes to the food banks in any of the outlying communities. And also another indicator that more and more people are experiencing homelessness is the ever-growing number of faith communities who are providing meals in the Yelm, in the Rainier, and in Chenino area. Roof as well operates in Rochester, and that's even a more rural area. And so when we consider solutions for homelessness, it's so important that we consider full county solutions and not just those that affect the major areas.
Yeah, or downtowns. And one of the strengths of this particular program is that we'll be looking at some of the complexities and varieties of problems and solutions, so that we won't just get stuck in this, oh, it's one of those downtown Olympia things.
Could I add
Yes,
too,
please.
Glenn? We get used to the idea of a homeless person as a person on the street and maybe panhandling and sleeping downtown, but we have other segments of homelessness in Thurston County as well, which are youth. We have teens who are living, who maybe their families have broken up and they're now don't have a home to go to. They kind of take it on their own and stay with friends or live on the street, actually, in extreme cases. And we also have families who are homeless. So we have families sleeping in cars and doubling up, as Selena's talking about, unfortunately being sheltered in church basements and things like that.
Yeah, there's just a great variety, and people will find any little Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 26 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, economic justice, and nonviolent social change. Every few years, we've produced a program niche they can, and so when we look at solutions, we got to make sure that we pay attention to all the different segments.
Exactly, who have distinctly different needs. Right, right.
And then meet their particular needs rather than a one-size-fits-all thing that leaves individual needs unmet.
And the ever-growing challenge, of course, is we're able to more and more identify specific needs, but at the same time, the funds are shrinking because war continues. And so we are more challenged now than we probably were at the beginning of this decade.
Yeah, yeah. We should help the viewers understand that this large-scale homelessness that we've been seeing for a number of years now is not something that's inherent, not something that's necessary. And although, like in the Depression of the 1930s, a lot of people were homelessness, we ended up with prosperity from the 40s on into the mid-70s. Wages peaked in this country in the mid-70s, and they've actually been declining since the mid-70s. And a lot of people don't realize that when Ronald Reagan was governor of California in the 70s, he cut funding for the state institutions and failed to follow through with funding for community-based mental health services. So a whole bunch of people got released from mental health institutions, had no place to go, no services, and they ended up on the streets. And we've had those policies persisting, especially after he became president. And the priorities of our federal government have shifted away from meeting people's needs and more toward, war and tax breaks for the rich and tax